Welcome to the History of European Theatre podcast, and thanks for joining me on this journey through millennia of theatrical history. Episode 163, A Statue in Verona, the Afterlife of Romeo and Juliet. Last time I gave you some thoughts on Romeo and Juliet that came to me as I rewatched the play for the first time in many years. In this revisiting, I was particularly struck by two things: how much the character and actions of Juliet drive the play, and how the threat of violence runs through it, both of which I included in my discussion of the play. I was, of course, well aware of the enduring popularity of the play, an awareness that was only increased as I looked around at the copious amounts of scholarship and popular commentary that are available. Only a small portion of which I was actually able to read while still keeping to the podcast schedule. That reading led me to many stories about and thoughts on the afterlife of the play and its continuing influence on Western culture. So, for today's episode, I have selected just a few stories and thoughts that illustrate that continuing influence. There are two hotspots on any tourist visit to Verona. The well-preserved Roman amphitheatre dating from 38 CE is one of the best-preserved examples of Roman entertainment architecture in Italy and is still a venue for performance of grand opera right up to today. When I visited a few years ago, elements of the larger-than-life set for Verdi's Aida were waiting outside the arena. Associated with this, the tourist should also take in the Roman wall that still partially surrounds the town. But when one gets into the streets of the old town, there is a noticeable movement and a gathering towards one particular spot. I've had the pleasure of visiting Verona twice, and on both occasions I can remember the ever-increasing crush of the crowd as people funneled towards a walled gateway into a small courtyard. There was a frisson of excitement in the air, and it was soon clear that the focus of the entire crowd was on one particular spot: a bronze statue of a young woman. This is, of course, Juliet, and as tourists, we are all here to see her. Some, like me, are here because we have an interest in Shakespeare. We are in the town, and the statue is always mentioned on the tourist advice that we've all read. Some, I'm sure, have no interest in Shakespeare at all, but still they come and are aware of who they are looking at and touching. For some, this is the one thing they have come to see in the town, the high point of their visit, and maybe it's the high point of their holiday wherever else they are travelling to. Since the ubiquity of the smartphone, the gathering around the statue has two purposes. In no particular order: the selfie or a group shot facilitated by another willing tourist giving temporary control of the camera, and the touching of the statue for good luck. This, of course, is not the statue in pure gold promised by Capulet at the end of the play, but a bronze version erected in the 1970s. Juliet is shown as very slender, with braided hair and wearing a long dress that she is lifting with her right hand to reveal a foot. Her left hand is curled towards her shoulder in a manner that suggests she is being protective of herself. She needs to be. The statue has become highly polished by human touch in several places, and in two places in particular. Rubbing Juliet's right breast has become part of a tourist ritual. For men, it is said to bring luck in love. For women, fertility. If you stand for any length of time watching the hubbub, it is easy to notice that people approach the ritual with degrees of enthusiasm that vary from the demure and the slightly embarrassed to the positively lecherous. And then you notice that not only the right breast, but the left and the arms have all been polished by millions of human hands. Somehow, Juliet herself continues to stand slightly aloof from the rabble, and for all that burnished bronze, she remains cool in her demeanour. The slight air of sadness that drifts off the statue hardly seems resolute enough in the face of this tourist onslaught. However much she looks out towards the entrance of the courtyard, she has surely given up hope of ever seeing her Romeo rushing back from Mantua to save her. Today, Mantua to Verona, at just 25 miles difference, is less than an hour by road. In the 16th century, it was perhaps a day's travel, 9 hours of walking, less if a lift could be hitched in a cart. So at least Shakespeare got his Italian geography more or less right. Romeo could have got to and back from Mantua in the timescale of the play. But now, as then, there is no hope of rescue for Juliet. The statue that we see today is a replacement of the 1970s original, which itself replaced a previous statue. The original occupant of the courtyard was the Virgin Mary, and I'm not the first person to note the irony of the Holy Virgin being replaced by a young woman of Juliet's character. Some years after the erection of the statue of Juliet, it was noticed that the multiple touches the statue was receiving every day, and particularly the mildly acidic sweat from these hundreds, if not thousands of hands, was damaging the statue. In the area of her right breast, a hole had developed and become enlarged. When removed for repair, it was discovered that the statue had been the repository for notes written by hopeful tourists looking for love or some other romantically inclined act. Devotion to the Holy Virgin had truly been replaced by devotion to a new secular saint of Verona. Nero Constantini created the first statue in 1969. He had had a long career since the 1930s as a sculptor and portrait painter, but he died shortly after completing the first statue of Juliet. That original statue was funded by the Verona Lions Club, one branch of an international charitable organisation with strong links to the church. At that time, it was an all-male institution. When the statue had to be replaced, it was funded by the Catholic Insurance Agency, a major Italian finance house with a specialisation in insuring religious bodies. The veneration of a fictional character is of course not unique. The fictional home of Sherlock Holmes, 221B Baker Street, receives visits from fans of the great detective and many letters addressed to him to this day. When Conan Doyle invented the address, Baker Street did not reach into the 200s, but it was later extended, and a building society moved into the offices occupying numbers 219 to 229. For many years, an employee was devoted to answering the flow of letters, some of which were published in a collection in the 1980s. With similar devotion, you can visit Dracula's castle or grave, Elsinore Castle, both of which you might consider semi-fictional, or you can try to find platform 9 3/4 at King's Cross Station. It's a trend that started in the early days of tourism and has only been increased by the advent of filmed versions of classic and new stories, which enabled them to be more rooted in real places of the filming locations. And then there is the tourist industry around the literary greats themselves, where Shakespeare leads the pack, but Jane Austen and Charles Dickens and the Brontes and many others, where lives can be traced to particular sites, follow hard on his heels. The touching of statues and religious icons has been a common practice for even longer. I remember noticing the much smoothed and reduced right foot of the statue of St. Peter in his basilica in the Vatican, thanks to millions of touches by pilgrims, which can be a very meaningful experience for anyone with a religious sensibility. But Juliet is a fictional character, and there is a very different vibe here, something very much less spiritual and more earthy. Nearby notes left around the courtyard are dominated by the wishing or thankfulness for romance, but also feature personal philosophies covering a range of lifetime experiences and all reduced to a few lines. I didn't spot any that dealt with teenage suicide, gang violence or bigamy, but then I didn't read them all. The building adjoining the courtyard, that is the home to the statue, is also part of the experience. The house, the Casa de Giulietta, is a 13th century building which has been subject to much modification over the centuries. It originally belonged to the Di Capello family, but was acquired from the latest in a long line of owners by Verona City Council in 1907, particularly because of the popular belief that it was the birthplace of Juliet Capulet. The interior rooms make up a small museum, which I suspect most visitors to the statue don't bother to walk around. It includes items from two of the filmed versions of Romeo and Juliet, the 1936 version directed by George Cukor and the Franco Zeffirelli 1968 version. The centrepiece is the bed from the Zeffirelli version, where you are invited to imagine the young lovers sealing their marriage. Taking in the museum only serves to reinforce the fakeness of the whole experience, but full marks to Verona Tourist Board for milking the association for every last drop of tourist income. And no visit to the house is complete without stepping out onto the second-floor balcony, which is quite an attractive feature, but this too is not authentic. It was added in the early 20th century and constructed using 14th century marble. Occasionally, a would-be Romeo and Juliet clear enough space on the balcony and dramatically declare their love for each other, using Shakespeare's words or their own, in what they seem to consider the most romantic spot in the world. Most of us simply look over the thronging crowd around the statue and beat a hasty retreat. And of course, that exit is through the inevitable gift shop, filled with Romeo and Juliet themed items which don't get anywhere near beyond kitsch. You can own Juliet's breast on a keyring if you really want to. The best-selling items seem to be the love locks of various shapes and sizes, all ready with shape for your own note to be scrawled or inserted into, and then all you need to do is find space on a nearby railing to deposit your purchase. This is actually quite a challenge. Every space on every railing near the courtyard appears to be taken, and as you walk away from the area, railings with spaces only slowly become apparent. Despite attempts by the local authorities to clear the railings and stop the practice, there seems no end to it. At first it seems strange that these love locks remind me of pilgrims' tokens that are found scattered around religious sites and which were the first form of tourist tat. Badges, memorial coins, small statues, vials of holy blood or water, and other replicated items of varying quality and authenticity have been found near sites of pilgrimage since medieval times, at least, and given the intense vibe of Juliet's statue and the courtyard, perhaps being reminded of pilgrims' tokens is not so odd, despite the very secular backstory. I wonder if the love locks are really so different from those religious items in their meaningfulness to the person who left them behind. There is another site in Verona that is a similarly popular point of pilgrimage for fans of Juliet. There is a museum in what used to be a Franciscan church in the Via Shakespeare. Now, I'm sure that street does not bear its original name, although I've not been able to ascertain when it was changed. The museum is home to a small red marble sarcophagus. This, it is claimed, was the resting place of Juliet, and by extrapolation, the place where it rests in, what was the crypt of the church, is the site for the final end of Romeo and Juliet. This story has so many holes in it that it is frankly amazing that it has become a site of touristic pilgrimage, and a much darker one than the house and the courtyard. Here we are invited to consider the darker side of the great romance. Shakespeare quotes adorn the surrounding walls, but are far less inspiring than the frescoes that inhabit the rest of the ex-monastery, which is now a museum of frescoes. These works of art seem still very vibrant despite their age and delicate nature. They speak to the diversity of Italian life and religious devotion in a much more positive way than the alleged tomb does. Nevertheless, the Verona tourist website proclaims confidently that this is the place where Juliet was buried and where the epilogue to Shakespeare's tragedy takes place. The most entertaining thing about the tomb, which is probably Roman in its origin and first use, is the stories of earlier ardent female fans of the play, and of Juliet in particular, throwing themselves into the cold stone to try to capture the essence of Juliet's tragedy. Today, the sarcophagus is suitably guarded, so that cannot happen again. These ladies were inspired by reading the play or seeing it acted on the stage. But for some, the Romeo and Juliet that they were familiar with was a very different one from the one we imagine and see today. Here is just one example. Through the 1700s, Romeo and Juliet, like other Shakespeare plays, went through a process of adaptation, with a view to improving Shakespeare. For the star-crossed lovers, this meant, in some cases, saving their lives. In others, they were given a few final moments together, and in yet others, characters were removed from that final scene so that Juliet's determination is not caused by the threat of discovery, but only by her intense desire to be with her Romeo. And it wasn't only this final scene that were changed, but many elements of the plot were in various cases. In 1744, Theophilus Cibber was running an unlicensed season at London's Haymarket Theatre. Although the season was being tolerated, it was causing him a lot of stress, but perhaps not as much as his recent divorce from his second wife was. In the case of divorce in Georgian London, public sympathy was almost always with the husband, and it was the woman who was socially shunned and shamed. However, Cibber was not greatly liked or admired even by those who he employed in the theatre, and much to his annoyance, he soon realised that the public saw him as the problem here. During his first marriage, he had openly cheated on his actress wife, mother of his 2 daughters, before her death, a death that many attributed to Cibber himself, as he had forced her to continue to act in a role on stage until she collapsed mid-performance and then died. Somehow, he then managed to pick up a younger version for wife number 2 in the form of actress and singer Susanna Arne. She was said to command such a talent in her voice that Handel composed with her in mind. She was astute too, and made sure that she had a prenuptial agreement in place that kept her theatrical earnings separate from anything that her husband acquired from her through the marriage. Cibber soon broke that agreement, got hold of the money, and effectively forced her into a relationship with a young lover, one William Sloper. Sloper did actually love Susanna, and when she left her husband to live with him, Cibber first tried to abduct her, and then spent years stalking and menacing her while claiming that Sloper was detaining her against her will. He even went to the extent of getting handbills printed to defend his reputation and besmirch hers. He should have realised that he had misjudged the mood of the public when rotten fruit was thrown at him when he next took to the stage. When Cibber took the couple to court twice, they finally fled to Ireland to escape his venom, but returned in 1742, when Susanna appeared as Desdemona on the London stage. Riled and with his career on the wane, Cibber decided that a new adaptation of Romeo and Juliet, penned by himself, would win the day. And he hit on what he thought was a fantastic idea. His own 15-year-old daughter by his first wife would play Juliet. What could possibly go wrong with that? His rewritten prologue described Juliet as still in the husk of infancy, and asked the audience to be the ripening sun to her fair bud. Cibber was 39 years old in 1744, so however much we make allowances for how times have changed, it is difficult to imagine just how queasy audience members must have felt. How can such an ageing Romeo have seemed anything less than predatory, not to mention the lingering smell of incest that must have hung over the production? Cibber was a master at manipulating his daughter on and off stage. His rewritten Juliet is betrothed to Romeo by her father before the feud begins. This Juliet is no capricious, spontaneous youth, but a compliant daughter. This was not the first time that Cibber had turned to his daughter to save his flagging fortunes. He had staged a benefit for the then 9-year-old Jenny and her sister, trading on the sympathy he expected following their stepmother's departure from the family home. Contemporary commentators seem to agree that any money collected was going to support Cibber's lavish lifestyle rather than for the benefit of his daughters. Rival theatre manager David Garrick hated everything about the production, but particularly the exploitation of Jenny, saying that he had never heard so vile and scandalous performance in my life. The girl, I believe, may have genius, but unless she changes her prospector, she must be entirely ruined. Cibber was undaunted, and wrote and paid for promotional pieces to be run in the newspapers. Even after his season was closed, when the Lord Chancellor finally invoked the Licensing Act, he managed to get one more performance out of Jenny for a benefit performance. For this, he wrote an epilogue for Juliet that included praise for her father's genius. Abandoning any attempt at pretending that the benefit was just for Jenny, the epilogue acknowledged that the audience's bounty was for the benefit of both father and daughter. Sadly, there was no happy ending for Jenny. In 1761 she married a Hertfordshire schoolmaster of no great prospects, and left the theatre. She died a year later. Cibber's career continued to decline as his bombastic acting style went further and further out of fashion, and his excessive drinking took its toll. He survived by taking small parts and mounting occasional productions of his own. In 1757, Thomas Sheridan, a prominent Irish actor, offered him some work at the Theatre Royal in Dublin. Ever hopeful in a revival of his fortunes, Cibber leapt at the chance and bought passage to Ireland. The ship he and 60 other passengers were on got caught in a storm off the coast of Scotland and was wrecked. Cibber drowned somewhere off the Dee estuary. In the history of the performance of the play and its cultural influence, it is noticeable that as a leading role, Romeo just doesn't cut it in the same way that Juliet does. He is only really present as part of the pair, not in his own right, as a champion of reckless love. Perhaps this is because of some of the things I mentioned last time, most of all the inherent fakeness of his Petrarchan posturing. For those who remember it, his desire for Rosalind undermines the supposed purity of his love for Juliet, and his role in the play is much less in control than Juliet is. Although his name has become synonymous with a youth who is deeply and passionately in love, it is often said in the context of being something that is overpowering and not quite believable or honest. Only as a foil to Juliet does he take his place in the cultural heritage of Western society. Franco Zeffirelli's film of the play that was released in 1968 focuses on Juliet more than any other. Billed as an adaptation for the love generation by the producers, Juliet is seen to reject the wishes of her parents, here representing the generation who supported the Vietnam War, and the constrained values of the 1950s, yet wanting nothing but a conventional marriage with her young lover. She binds herself to Romeo by marriage, only to find that he too is tainted by the trail of violence that he cannot escape from. Zeffirelli made the most of the traditional Italian settings and the charms of his Juliet, the young Olivia Hussey, as the camera lingers over both. In keeping with the liberalities of the time, the film includes a nude scene, which would come back to haunt Paramount Pictures when, 55 years later, the lead actors sued the company on the basis that they were both underage when the film was made. Hussey was just 15 at the time, and therefore subjects of sexual abuse. Zeffirelli was not around to answer the allegation that he had encouraged them into performing the scene despite previous assurances to the contrary, having died in 2019. And ultimately the suit did not succeed, as the judge deemed that the scene was not sufficiently sexually suggestive, and both leads had over many years continued to promote and discuss the film without bringing their concerns before a court before. The film was a huge success, recouping its budget by a factor of more than 30 times, and garnering a number of significant awards and nominations. Looking back at some of the promotional material for the film, it looks like the promoters were stuck between trying to promote Juliet towards the older and younger audiences. The audience more used to the theatre production of the play probably didn't want to see Juliet positioned as too alluring or promiscuous, but that view was certainly used to attract that love generation that the film was expressly aimed at. This only highlights one of the enduring facets of the play, that Juliet is on the face of it a symbol of youthful innocence, but has a controlling role in the play that is beyond her years and experience, which is just one of the things that makes the play so enduring and a play that can be crafted to fit all times. But there is one adaptation where Romeo is thrust to the fore, and as he is given a more significant role, Juliet inevitably becomes less significant. The origins of West Side Story go back to 1948 when choreographer Jerome Robbins was working at the Actors Studio on Romeo and Juliet. Romeo was being played by Montgomery Clift, who was then 27, but experienced for his age, having been acting since he was 14. For all of that experience, he was struggling to find Romeo's true motivations and to completely inhabit the character as was demanded by the ethics of the Actors Studio. Robbins, who was probably Clift's lover at the time, suggested that he think of Romeo in terms of modern gangs of New York. It isn't recorded how much Clift appreciated that advice, but for Robbins it sparked an idea. A few months later, at the beginning of 1949, he called Leonard Bernstein, who he had worked with on the musical On the Town. The first one, we should note, to make use of a multiracial chorus on Broadway. And together they concocted an adaptation of Shakespeare's play set in the worlds between Catholics and Jews. Screenwriter Arthur Lawrence was brought in. This early version of what would become West Side Story is more about interfaith rather than interracial tensions. Shamed by her family in this version, Juliet is said to have drowned and Romeo overdoses on Friar Lawrence's pills before reviving in time to exchange a few words before they died together. The collaborators couldn't agree on the tone of the piece and work ground to a halt in April 1949. It was only revived 6 years later when Arthur Lawrence saw an uptick in interest in New York gang violence. In fact, it was a subject that was rarely off the front pages of the newspapers. All of a sudden, their idea seemed very topical. He got together with Bernstein, and they repositioned the story in the world of the New York gang and capitalised on the recent influx of Puerto Rican migrants. In further drafts of the script and the musical numbers, Juliet and her family still featured heavily, with Juliet playing a role that tried to bridge the gap between her Puerto Rican family and her new American home. In October 1955, Stephen Sondheim joined as lyricist, and the show that had been titled Romeo became West Side Story. As the script and the music developed, the emphasis shifted from the romance in the story to an account of the rivalry between gangs. At the time, Robbins admitted that the show was about intolerance, not love. Here, there were no longer any doubt about the root causes of the Capulet-Montague feud. Inequality and race hatred stoked those fires. Juliet, now renamed Maria, had an ever-reducing role in subsequent script drafts. But right up to 1956, it was she alone who died, until it was deemed that the death of Romeo, now renamed Tony, was the correct and only tragic ending to the show. In that process, Tony becomes a very much more fleshed-out character than Maria ever is. We know far more about his background and his recent life where he tried to break away from the gang than we do of Maria's. It is no coincidence that Maria has no solo song to perform, whereas Tony has two. And of the significant songs she does sing in, it is reported that none of the creators particularly liked I Feel Pretty or One Hand, One Heart. Even Tonight is an ensemble piece, and for many, the best set piece of the show is the song America, where Maria just sits and watches. West Side Story went on to have very successful preview runs in Washington and Philadelphia, and then a decent run on Broadway for 732 performances. The London production in 1958 ran for 1,039 performances. Although there have been several significant revivals since then, it became a truly iconic musical with the release of the 1961 filmed version, which, co-directed by Jerome Robbins, stuck closely to the stage show and his original choreography, and, in the end, gave more space than any other version does to his original point of inspiration, Romeo. There are so many more ways that Romeo and Juliet has been subsumed into Western culture that I could have mentioned. Operas and ballets, of course, but also frequent name checks in songs, my favourites being Peggy Lee's sultry hit Fever, What a Lovely Way to Burn Indeed, and the more extended attention of Dire Straits, and Lou Reed's playful and typically sardonic yet thoughtful Romeo Had Juliet. Then there's fiction. I note that the Goodreads website has 132 books listed under Romeo and Juliet retellings. If you want to see a production of the full original play, then the BBC version on DVD from 1978 is very good, one of the best from that BBC series. If an adaptation is your preference, then Baz Luhrmann's 1996 version is great fun, and you can just about forgive the heavy cutting to fit the play into an hour and 50 minutes, which includes some time to linger on some stunning visuals, because it is so exuberant and entertaining, and the soundtrack is cracking too. Next time we are onto more controversial ground as I tackle The Merchant of Venice. a comedy only in the sense that it is not strictly speaking a tragedy, and a play that features one of Shakespeare's most enduring characters, not the merchant of the title, but Shylock the moneylender, who has some interesting ideas about forfeiture and the collection of debts. In the meantime, if you've not done so already, please join the Facebook page or group, or find the podcast on Instagram or Blue Sky, just to keep up to date with new episodes and other theatre-related things. If you do feel able to help out with the costs of running the podcast, then please head on over to Patreon, where you will find additional content for a small monthly fee or a one-off donation. You can also make a one-off show of support through Ko-fi.com, and a special mention this time for some recent donations I've received through Ko-fi.com. The financial help is of course very welcome, but as important to me is the knowledge that you're out there and interested in and enjoying what I'm doing enough to make those pledges. So thank you very much. You can contact me by email at thoetp@gmail.com, or through the website, where you can leave me a voice message by clicking on the microphone icon, or you can write to me on the contact page. That's all at www.thehistoryofeuropeantheatre.com.